I give you two paintings that should look familiar, for we spent some time during our last artifact comparing and contrasting them. This is David's Of the Thraciae, painted in 1785, and Fragonard's The Swing, painted about 19 years earlier. And in comparing and contrasting these two works, the Rococo on the right and Neoclassicism on the left, we were able to knock out an overwhelming majority of the 18th century, for we begin with Rococo, and that lasts about 66 years. And it's during the last 50 years or so of the 18th century where neoclassicism thrives. But as I mentioned last time, the art world is oftentimes a pendulum. And if the pendulum begins on the right during the 18th century and eventually moves to the left, and that is we go from everything is happy to everyone is going to die, eventually the pendulum will swing back in a different direction, especially in different kinds of ways. And so there are more than just these two artistic styles that developed during the 18th century. For the third, that begins towards the middle and back end of neoclassicism, is that of Romanticism. And Romanticism will occupy our next couple of artifacts. So I want to give you two depictions of the same painting by a Swiss-born but British-trained art maker named John Henry Fuseli. Although if you were to talk to John Henry Fuseli, he would probably prefer his German name, Johann Heinrich, but once you get to England, they make you British. So I want to give you a painting here. He did this in several different versions. The work is called The Nightmare, and I ask you to consider a very complicated question, one we've done a lot of work on, and that is, what do you see? We can begin with this sleeping woman wearing white, and of course by now we're able to infer white as somehow an indication of her relative purity. She's reclining on this bed. Her arms are raised over her head. I mean, she looks like she's about to fall off of this poor thing. Um, in the background is this like decapitated horse head kind of floating back there. This little sort of Netherlandish beastie guy is sitting on her chest, and all things considered, it looks as if it has been painted with a great emphasis on brushstroke. And so when we, in a second, I'll refer back to David's linear composition with the of the Horatii. But for now, let's talk about this as being very painterly. And what that means is that there's evidence of the artistic brush, and that there is, when you look at it, it looks like a painting rather than looking more like a photograph. So this is painterly as opposed to the linear quality of David's work. Now, if we look around this room and we know what to look for, we can see some pretty interesting things. For example, on the left-hand side of this composition, there's a tabletop. And in that tabletop right here is a glass vial. And that glass vial, without doubt, is laudanum. Laudanum is a tincture of opium. So you might have heard of opium. Opium and morphine are part of the same chemical families, and they are, well, they're pharmaceutical drugs. Laudanum was something that people used during the 18th and 19th century to calm their nerves and go to sleep. I mean, this was, what's this good sleep aid? I guess I don't know, like Tylenol PM on by a factor of 100, a few drops of laudanum, and it was good night, Irene. And so this woman has been shown as if she is in a remarkable deep state of slumber. Yet despite that, there is a sense of unrest on her face. This is not a peaceful sleep. This is a sleep filled with perhaps bad dreams, and that's exactly why it's called the nightmare. I remember one night going into my kid's room and him like literally sleeping kind of off the bed like this. And I knew the kid was in a deep sleep. Like her face suggests that she is sleeping deeply, but that the dreams are disconcerting. And in a few artifacts time, we'll talk a little bit about Freud, Sigmund Freud, and his interpretation of dreams. But for the time being, you should know that what Fuseli has done is taken this reclining female figure, dressed her in white, and put this dude on her and this thing back here to suggest the state of her internal being. Now I'm going to ask you a question. It's one I've not asked you before, and it might seem to be a weird one, but here goes. How does this make you feel? And that question, the last word in it, feel, is one of the defining characteristics of the Romantic movement. Romanticism does not mean like St. Valentine's Day. Like to be romantic does not only mean to be like lovey-dovey. Like when we say, "Oh, he's so romantic," like the image we conjure up is like flowers or candy or whatever one does to be romantic. But as a literary and artistic term, romanticism means feeling, like the primacy of feeling over anything else. And so one could be like an emo kid who like wears all gray and does nothing but brood all day, and that would be as romantic as anything else. And so Fuseli, as an art maker, and the romantics who surround him are interested in the idea of feeling rather than of intellectual engagement. And let me really drive this point home for you. For I bring back to you David's Oath of the Herati. The goal of this isn't for you to feel. The goal of this is to have you think. And I'll give you, I'll speak a little bit about this, but I remember when I was in graduate school and I was writing a letter of recommendation for an undergraduate student to go into a graduate program. And I'd never written anything like this before. And so I went to speak to one of my professors and said, you know, this student has asked me to write a letter of recommendation for them for graduate school. So here's what I've come up with. Tell me what you think. And so, although genuinely complimentary, Dr. Vennett said to me, you need to remove the phrase, I feel this student is well suited for graduate school, because I don't care about your feelings, I care about what you think. And so she suggested, I believe, or I am certain, or there is no doubt that, which are all stronger ideas than feeling, right? I feel hungry today, I feel thirsty. Those are different ideas than belief. David is asking you to think about something, intellectually engage with it, and then act. Fuseli is asking you to feel. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other. I mean, in my relationship with my lovely wife, I'm the thinker. Like I look at things logically. She's the feeler, so she responds to them in a different kind of way. They're not better or worse, they're just different. So Fuseli is attempting to have you engage with an idea on a feeling level, where David is asking you to think about it on an intellectual level. That difference between feeling on the left and thinking on the right is one of the big differences between the Romantic and the Neoclassical movement. But it's not the only difference. So I want to give you a couple of more, and we will see this play out quite consistently over the next 50 years or so. To begin with, these two works, they just look different as it pertains to like how the paint has been applied. And I spoke a little bit about this when talking about the David's Oath of the Herati and Fragonard's The Swing, and we talked about it as it pertains to the application of paint. So I mentioned to you, this painting here is much more linear. Linearity means that there's a strong artistic emphasis on the use of line. right, on the use of line, whereas Fragonard's is much more painterly. There is evidence of the artist's paintbrush. Now, this seems pretty painterly, and eventually we will get to the Impressionist artists when all bets are off. But when you look at this on the left and this on the right, you can tell a difference in regards to the artist's touch. The neoclassical time frame is much more linear. The Rococo is much more painterly. And the same is sort of true here. Still linear, but this is much more painterly. And we will see that continue on as we move through the Romantic period. There's a really fabulous German Romantic painter named Caspar David Friedrich. And I'm giving you a couple of his images here from about the same time, 1809. And so we've dodged ahead a couple of decades. But again, a couple of decades is a lot to you. You're not 44. It's a blink in time. So on the left we have Monk by the Sea, and this is Abbey in an Oak Forest. And I ask you to think about these two objects with the idea of how do you feel? Like, isn't there a sense of solitude, of loneliness, of maybe the insignificance of the human body, of the human of humanity within the idea of nature? Like, like when I think about this, we have this little solitary figure in the foreground at the edge of this beach, the sea raging off in the background, and this incredibly large, overwhelming, stormy sky in the background. That all things considered, this is an image that both seems just a little bit scary to me, although maybe not to you, but it seems scary to me, to say nothing of the fact of the insignificance of the figure within the work of art. And I think the same is true in the Abbey in an Oak Forest. There are human figures there, but there's also other things that give us a sense of unease, right? Clearly, this is the westwork of a now dilapidated church. There's a cross there, so presumably a gravestone. And we have these trees, these oak trees that are rising up, and it's clearly winter time. So we can think about this as being not only like at dusk or dawn, but the chill in the air, the smallness of the human figure, the seeming lifelessness of these oak trees, to say nothing of the dilapidated, falling down structure of a once proud building. Whenever I look at Friedrich paintings, I feel like there's a sense of solitude about them, a sense of quiet. I mean, these two paintings, again, done about the same time frame, I think drive that point home, doesn't it? Because when you look at them, there is a sense of quiet. Like these two guys here on the left and right, you don't get the idea that they're arguing about politics, right? Or something else in their lives, that they're standing there looking out at the sea, listening to the waves, watching the light glimmer and the ships sail by. That there's an inherent sense of solitude and quiet. And perhaps Friedrich's most famous painting is the one here on the left-hand side. It's his Wanderer Above the Mist. And interestingly, this book shows up on the cover of two different books I own on my shelf. Those books are from the same academic discipline. So I give you a second. Those two books, what do you think the academic discipline is that they're on? How about this? They're both on philosophy books. And doesn't that seem to make sense somehow? Like, this isn't a chemistry book or an engineering book. I mean, maybe it could be like a book on mountains or climatology or something. But if you think about this guy up there, what's he doing? And isn't he thinking? Like that's what he's doing. I mean, one of those books is called The Ideology of the Aesthetic. And to be perfectly fair, it's a book that is on the interaction of philosophy and like what we about an aesthetic. So an aesthetic is a branch of philosophy that deals with the art of beauty. Um, but this is a very great example of German Romanticism. It's about looking and think and feeling and almost solitude. So if we did a little bit of English and a little bit of German, let's go and do a little bit of Spain. And if you're only going to talk about one Spanish romantic artist, and honestly we are, the guy to look at is Francisco Goya. This is a portrait of the King of Spain, Carlos IV, and his family. Um, and it should look a little bit familiar to you. Let's think about who we have present. I'll start King, Queen, family. In the background, we have portraits. And in the background here, look at that. We have a canvas on a stretcher and a guy looking out at us, the artist. And in many ways, this was Goya conjuring up his inner Diego Velázquez, which, I mean, this is a part of the great tradition of art making. And that is what we do is we take something that was great and we try to do our new version of it. And so a painting done 150 some years beforehand, Goya is looking at that and thinking, I'm going to make my new Velázquez for a new Spanish monarch. When you look at this painting, I think you can get an idea of the painterliness that was inherent to the Romantic movement. And we will see that continue even more so when we look at a cycle of paintings that Goya does in 1814. So as a way to understand these paintings, let's talk a little bit about what was going on in Europe in the early part, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And we have to return back to our French tyrant by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. It's Napoleon did just about everything he could in order to make Europe French. And let's talk about some of the places where Napoleon went and brought the French army with him. So Italy, he crowned himself king of Rome. He went to Austria and Germany. He went to Belgium. He went to Moscow. Right? He invaded Russia. Like, was it one of his better decisions because he underestimated something called the Russian winter, which no one should ever do? But he invaded Russia. Um, you should read. I mean, like all nerds like me think you should read big books, but let me tell you, War and Peace, something I've read 4 times, is just a masterpiece of human drama, and it takes place in Russia during the Napoleonic invasion. And it's not really about war, it's about people and love and feelings and court life and finding out who you are. And it is just a masterpiece. It's one of my top 5 books. You have to read it. But that gives you an extent of Napoleon, well, to the east of France, but he also took over Spain as well. And in doing so, placed his kid brother on the Spanish throne. That didn't go so well. And so eventually there was an uprising. That uprising happened on the 2nd of May. And on the 3rd of May, those who were part of the uprising were taken out and executed. So as a way to start this discussion, let's go to the more what I think is the more important of these compositions. The one on the right, the executions of the 3rd of May, 1808, comma, painted in 1814. So let's start with an interesting little tidbit that maybe at first you hadn't noticed. Let's think about this painting as it relates to David's painting as that relates to the difference in time between painting and the event it chronicles. So this was painted in 1808, or pardon me, it was painted in 1814 of an event that happened in 1808, and that means from the moment it occurred until the painting was 6 years. David's painting, part of the neoclassical time frame, it was a painting done in 1785 of an event that happened about 600 BCE, a difference of about 2,500 years BC, or 2,500 years. And so what I mean to suggest is that neoclassical artists often, not always, but often, were interested in chronicling events that happened a long, long time ago. Romantic artists often were interested in depicting the current event of the day. 6 years is a blink, right? So this is like a ripped from the headlines kind of deal here. And let's think about who we see. To begin with, we can think about the composition from the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see here, we have this firing squad. Their backs are to us. They are anonymous. It's like they are people who we can't even identify with in some ways. I mean, the reason why I created a video to introduce this course with my head on it is so that you could understand that I'm not just some voice. I'm actually a real person, right? I have eyes and ears and a mouth, and there's a reason why I also sort of tell you stories about my own life is so that you can have an appreciation for kind of me as a person. One of the things that sucks about me is there's a group of you and I don't know anything about you. I wish I could, but that's the nature of like online dual enrollment classes. Like the point of that is the way we identify with people on an initial level is through faces. Like I could take my head and put it on a body 2 inches taller or 2 inches shorter or 20 pounds heavier or 20 pounds lighter. And I don't think any of my students would ever necessarily know the difference if I walked in on a Monday or a Wednesday. But you put me on a different head and they're going to notice. And so these people here are anonymous. It's like a killing machine that has no humanity. They're just there. In the background, you can see we have the church, right? That's the cathedral. And let's get to this guy. Let's call him Bob. How has Bob been shown? Well, to begin with, he has his hands raised up in the universal gesture of please don't shoot me, right? Like, please don't shoot me. My dad once told me when I was a kid, or when I started driving, he said, when a police officer pulls you over, or when a police officer pulls you over, they're frightened because they have no idea who you are or what you have in the car, right? It's like a moment of unknown. And I bet like the principle of Occam's razor, Occam's razor is a philosophical idea that says if given a variety of options, the simplest is likely the most likely. And so for example, let's say you wake up in the morning and you have a sniffle. The most likely explanation is that you have a cold rather than you have a rare form of nasal cancer, right? So that's Occam's razor. So the most simple explanation when a police officer pulls me over is that I'm a pretty benign person and I'm not going to hurt them. They're probably still worried about the nasal cancer form, but they still might be, but they're probably confident everything is going to be good. But I'll never forget getting pulled over once when I was 19 and my car was a little British sports car. I had the top down. I was zipping on my way to the university. I get pulled over. And the one thing I did was just put my hands up and grab the windshield. This was my gesture. It was a please don't shoot me, officer. I'm just 19 driving too fast in my British sports car. So gesture-wise, his arms are raised in an act of deference, in an act of supplication, an act of please don't kill me. And what's he wearing? He's wearing a white shirt, which again is not so subtle as a way of indicating his innocence. Now look at his right hand. And what do you see on that right hand? Actually, the left hand to a lesser extent, but right hand certainly. Look at this. See that hole there? What looks to be a hole? And actually see this there. Bob has been painted as if he has the stigmata. The stigmata are the wounds of Christ. And if you look at this, couldn't I sort of paint a cross here? Wouldn't, I mean, couldn't I almost do that and make it look as if he was hanging from a cross? So Goya is pulling out all the artistic stops. Bob here is innocent. He's wearing a white shirt. His arms are raised in an act of, please don't shoot me. He has the wounds of Christ, and we can easily imagine a cross hanging behind him. Now look at the way he's been painted, and I think you can understand the painterliness of this composition. Over here, you can see the other people who are present, certainly the other painterliness as well. If Bob represents the during, then this person here represents the after. And all this line of people here that extends back into space, all the way back there, this is the before. Goya gives us both the result of this faceless executioner squad, the during of that faceless executioner squad, and also the really long line of people whose fate has yet to come, but it doesn't look like it's going to go well. Bob has been illuminated only by this lantern here in the foreground, which projects this super bright light upon him. This composition is not asking you to intellectually engage with it, right? When you look at it, Goya is twisting and tweaking your feelings. And it's remarkably clear what Goya thinks. It's remarkably clear what Goya wants you to think, that Bob here is innocent. Bob does not deserve the fate that's coming his way. Bob should not die, but Bob is going to. There is a famous poem written during the early part of the 19th century, written by a German named Goethe. And the Goethe is called Faustus. And Faustus, in a nutshell, is about a man who kind of trades in his soul for knowledge. And there's a great line in that play. It becomes a play. I mean, it's written like a play, but it's a poem. And there's a great line in that, and it says, "Feeling is all." That's such a great romantic line from the 19th century. Feeling is all. And I think Goya would agree with that. This painting was about feeling. It was about you understanding the horrific tragedy and massacre that happened. This could have been painted in a different kind of way that would ask you to address that tragedy in a different kind of way. But instead, Goya is asking you to feel. Now, this is one kind of branch of Romanticism. It's a current event scene that has been painted in a very painterly, romantic kind of way. But there's another branch of Romanticism, and that branch of Romanticism it's kind of like it's got 2 feet. It's got a foot on each bank of the river. One bank of the river is romantic subject matter, and the other bank of the river is a kind of neoclassical style. And I want to talk about that because I think it's a very interesting middle ground. And the painter you're looking at here, his name is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Ingres is spelled Ingres. And so, if you're not a French speaker, you might think it's Ingres, but it's actually Ang. And this was done in 1814, which is the exact same year that Goya painted the executions of the 3rd of May, 1808. So we're dealing with a very similar time frame. Ang is French. Ang studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, just like David did. Ang received the Rome Prize, just like David did. And Ang learned painting from David. And so, in many ways, Ang was one of many painters that David trained. I mean, David trained an entire generation of neoclassically inspired art makers. And Ang kind of waffles. He sometimes does very strict neoclassical paintings that are very linear and neoclassical in subject, and sometimes he does romantic subject paintings with a neoclassical style, and this is a great example of that. This is his Grand Odalisque, and an odalisque is a French word for woman who works in a Turkish harem. And a harem is a Turkish brothel. And a brothel is a house for women of ill repute. And women of ill repute sometimes are called prostitutes. And this is what that woman is. She's a prostitute who works in a harem. And here she is reclining on this divan, and she has been shown exotic. So I mentioned that one subject that the Romantics often run through is the idea of the current, the new, right? And this is certain current and new, but it's also another branch of that. It is the far away and the exotic. This isn't a Parisian prostitute, although there were Parisian prostitutes. Prostitution was not illegal in Paris in the 19th century. We'll look at least several prostitutes as the 19th century goes on. This wasn't a Parisian prostitute. This was a Turkish odalisque, and that is more far away and more exotic. So let's think about what we see with this young lady because she's quite fabulous. I give you here her headdress. She's looking out at us. She has a kind of turban on. Isn't that fancy? And she has a pin here or brocade or whatever it is that women wear in their hairs. And with what looks to be a ruby and pearls, I bet I could buy a nice house with that. In her lower body, you can see she's holding a peacock fan, right? Those are peacock feathers. And this was the kind of thing she could use to fan herself throughout the day. And at the foot of this, you can see this. And you might not know what that is. That's incense, right? So incense, and this is a pipe. And that's not tobacco in it. That's hashish. Which is illegal in most states in the United States now, right? So this is clearly someone not in Paris. This material is called damask. Damask. Damask is called such because it used to be made exclusively in Damascus, which was a city in Syria. And so this is the far away, the exotic. Now let's talk about something that might be a little bit disconcerting to you. And let me back up a little bit. When we talked about David, I mentioned to you that he studies at the École des Beaux-Arts, and the École des Beaux-Arts was the officially state-sponsored, paid for by the King art school in Paris. And the one thing art makers learned was how to draw the human body. Let me give you an example of this. I didn't show it to you last time, but here's a painting that David started but never finished. This is a sketch for it. It's called The Oath of the Tennis Courts. This thing was going to be enormous, and it was going to be so enormous that David never finished it. I think the final scale was going to be like 40 by 35 or something. Just preposterous. And the only thing that survives from it, as far as I know, is an enormous canvas that has been cut down, and it's more or less this piece here, right? And so he made a canvas this big. He never got that far in it, mostly because the French are good for a new revolution every 5 years. And so a new government kind of blew into town. But I want to show you how David rolled. This was how a neoclassical artist worked on a painting. First step, draw the male nude. These guys all would have been clothed, of course. But in order to get them right, one of the things they have to do was get the body right. So this guy right here was no doubt going to be wearing clothing. But in order to understand the gestures, David has to know the muscles. So what do you learn as a neoclassical art maker? You learn how to draw the body. Could David draw the body? The answer is A, yes, he could. Now, my next question is, could David teach a young man to draw the body? And the answer is A, yes, he could. And yet, does this body look good to you? Bad word. Does this body look accurate to you? What is a bit off about this body? Because it probably is clear to you, I suspect, right? Doesn't it look as if this young lady has about 3 too many vertebrae in her lower back? I mean, this woman is like 80% woman and 20% prehistoric fish. Like, I've never seen a back quite like this. My goodness, to say nothing of, and I beg your pardon, her rump. Look at this thing. I mean, only in art history classes do I get to announce, look at her rump. Look at this thing. That's the most enormous, elongated butt I've ever seen. To say nothing of the fact that I don't know how this knee and that femur is ever going to insert into any hip socket ever. Wow. Can I tell you, I took my first art history class in the spring of 1995. And I'm not sure if we looked at this painting because it was kind of an art and society one semester class, kind of like this is. I don't know if we looked at this. I no doubt saw this in 1997. So I say all of this to say I've been laughing at this painting for at least 22 years now. Like, this is hysterical to me. This is the most illogical human body I've ever seen. Okay, that's not true, but it is an illogical human body. And Ang absolutely could have painted a human body exactly as he saw it. I mean, I can show those things to you. And instead, what he's doing is doing things for a very specific effect, right? He's trying to elongate and make her body appear to be a bit more elegant and languid. And yet, he's working within an artistic tradition, right? We didn't really look at Titian's Venus of Urbino in this class. This is a really great example of the high Renaissance in Venice. It's one of the real showstoppers. And if we were to compare and contrast these two images, we can think about this reclining female nude on a divan, including a white cloth. And this woman here, she's been called the Venus of Urbino, but she wasn't a Greek goddess of love and beauty. She was the Duke of Urbino's courtesan, which is good work if you can get it, I suppose. But in order to hang a portrait of your mistress in your house, you can't actually let your wife know it's your mistress. And so it was called a Venus figure. So her nudity is cloaked under the broad umbrella of the Greek god system, because women can't be shown nude, but Greek goddesses can be. And so here she is with a little puppy dog here and women in the background pulling things out of something called a cassone. It's a kind of hope chest. This, he doesn't even try to hide her day job, or maybe her night job, or maybe she's on call. I don't know, but he doesn't even try to call that. He doesn't call her a Venus. He's like, yeah, she's a Turkish prostitute. And here she is, languidly looking out at you as if like waiting for you to say something. I mean, think about how she's looking at you. She's kind of demure. She's not looking shyly away as if I would be if I were sitting in front of someone naked. She's almost confident and submissive. And we will see a return to this in a couple of artifact times. So this is Aang. He has a romantic style, pardon me, a romantic subject with a neoclassical style. And as a way to drive this point home, I give you this drawing and this painting done within a decade of one another by two different artists in two different media, I grant you, but in two different styles. So let's think about these. Aang's drawing of the Italian composer Paganini and Delacroix's painting of the Italian composers Paganini. And I ask you, which of these two depictions gives you a better idea as to what he looked like? And I think with just a little bit of reflection, you would agree that the image on the left is an accurate representation of what Paganini looked like. But if you were to remove the violin under his arm, you don't really get an idea as to what Paganini is when you look at this. Could be a portrait of an aristocrat, a famous chemist, the Duke of someplace. This is not about capturing what Paganini did, only about what Paganini looks like. And in contrast to that, Delacroix's painting is little about what he looks like. And instead, what Delacroix attempted to convey was a sense of emotion, the vitality of the music that would overcome this Italian man when he's in the middle of playing a violin concerto. This is less about what he looks like and more about what he feels or experiences when he plays. And if you want to see a good example of this, you can do a Google search for John Mayer guitar face. Now, I got to tell you, I'm a closet John Mayer fan, and I've seen John Mayer in concert. Actually, I saw John Mayer in concert with a girlfriend in graduate school. I had no idea who John Mayer was, but what's her face wanted to go, and I went. He puts on a great show, and we were close. It was at Wolf Trap in DC. It was fabulous. And that guy, when he plays the guitar, his face transforms into something kind of scary. This is the Niccolo Paganini violin face. It's not about what he looks like, it's instead about what he feels when he plays. Looks like, feels. And this distinction is a great way to think about the neoclassical style, which Aang is working through here on the left, and the romantic style that Paganini is, or that Delacroix is working through on the right. And so our next artifact, we're going to continue looking at some romantic paintings. We'll talk about a Delacroix painting. We'll look at Jericho. And if I play my cards right, we might actually look at an American painter as well. More Romanticism next.